At 12:47 a.m., a millionaire kicked his 7 months pregnant wife so hard in a hospital room that she fell bleeding to the floor. His mistress. She laughed and kept filming. He thought his money made him untouchable. He thought no one would believe her. He was wrong. What happened next became the most explosive trial in Los Angeles history. $4 million embezzled. Secret recordings. A mother testifying against her own son. And one woman who refused to stay silent, even when the entire system tried to protect him. If you've ever wondered whether justice can defeat power, stay until the end. This story will shock you. And if it does, hit that like button and subscribe. Because stories like this need to be heard. This is the Midnight Fall. The clock on the wall of Oceanside Medical Center read 12:47 a.m. when the door to Suite 312 burst open. Claire Bennett, 7 months pregnant and hooked to an IV for severe dehydration, jolted awake from her first peaceful sleep in weeks. Her husband, Grant Westfield, stepped inside wearing a navy tuxedo that still smelled like champagne and expensive cigars. His cufflinks caught the fluorescent light as he moved toward her bed, but Claire's breath stopped completely when she saw the woman following behind him. Jade Rivers wore a silver cocktail dress that probably cost more than Claire's entire maternity wardrobe. Her phone was already raised, recording, as if she were documenting some kind of reality show instead of intruding into a hospital room at midnight. "Grant," Claire's voice cracked. "What are you doing here? The doctor said I need complete rest." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her like she was a stranger occupying a hotel room he'd accidentally booked twice. His jaw tightened in that way she'd learned to recognize over 3 years of marriage. The way that meant he'd already made a decision and nothing she said would change it. "You need to pack your things," Grant said, his voice cold and measured. "You're going to your mother's house in the morning. This arrangement isn't working anymore." Claire gripped the bed rail, her swollen belly making it hard to sit up properly. The fetal monitor beside her bed beeped steadily, tracking her baby's heartbeat. Their baby's heartbeat. "Arrangement," she whispered. "Grant, I'm your wife. I'm carrying your child." "You're carrying drama," he said flatly. "And I'm done with it." Jade shifted her weight, her designer heels clicking against the tile floor. She held her phone higher, making sure to capture every angle. "Babe, let's not make a huge scene," she said sweetly, as if she had any right to speak. "The car's waiting downstairs." Claire's hands trembled as she reached toward Grant. "Please, not here. Not now." The doctor said any stress could hurt the baby. But Grant's temper snapped like a wire pulled too tight. He shoved her reaching hand away with enough force to make her gasp. Then, with one careless motion, he kicked the metal bed rail. The impact sent a jolt through the entire frame. Claire's body, already weak and off balance, pitched sideways. She grabbed for something to hold onto but found only air. Her hip hit the cold linoleum floor first, then her shoulder, and finally her head cracked against the base of the IV stand. The fetal monitor screamed in red alarm. Blood began seeping through the thin fabric of her hospital gown, warm and terrifying against her thigh. Jade's hand flew to her mouth, but not in horror. She was trying not to laugh. "Oh my God," she whispered to Grant, still filming. "She's so dramatic." Claire clutched her belly, gasping. Every nerve in her body fired with panic. "My baby," she choked out. "Please, someone help my baby." The door flew open as Beth, the night nurse, ran in. Her eyes went wide when she saw Claire crumpled on the floor, the pool of blood spreading beneath her. "What happened?" Beth demanded, hitting the emergency call button on the wall. Grant straightened his jacket, composure already sliding back into place. "She tried to get out of bed too quickly. She's been unstable all evening." "That's not true," Claire gasped, but her voice was so weak it barely carried across the room. More staff rushed in. Dr. Catherine Pierce, the attending physician, dropped to her knees beside Claire, checking her pulse and barking orders. "Get me an ultrasound now. Check for placental abruption. Someone call OR and warn them we might need emergency surgery." Through the chaos and the pain, Claire's survival instinct kicked in. Her phone had fallen from the bedside table when Grant kicked the bed. It lay just inches from her face, screen side down. With trembling fingers, while everyone's attention was on her bleeding and the medical emergency, she managed to press the voice recording app before her hand went limp. Grant's voice carried across the room as he spoke to Jade in the hallway. She's been milking this pregnancy for months. I told her I wanted her out of my life. This is exactly the kind of manipulative behavior I've been dealing with. The phone captured every word. Doctor. Pierce looked up at Grant, her expression cold. Sir, I need you to step outside. Now. I'm her husband, and right now you're in the way of my patient's care. Out. As the medical team worked frantically to stabilize her, Claire felt consciousness slipping. The last thing she managed to do before the world went dark was swipe her thumb across her phone screen, uploading the recording to her cloud storage. The password protection engaged automatically. The monitor finally steadied. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the fog. Mild abruption. We're stabilizing both of them, but she needs to stay completely still for the next 48 hours. Minimum. Someone was crying. It took Claire a moment to realize it was her. Through the glass wall of her room, she could see Grant and Jade sitting in the waiting area. They weren't worried. They weren't even pretending to be worried. Jade was scrolling through her phone while Grant made a call, probably to his lawyer. Beth leaned close to Claire, her voice barely a whisper. Honey, I saw what happened. That wasn't an accident. Do you have someone I can call? Someone who can help you? Claire's mind swam through the fog of pain and medication. Most of her friends had drifted away over the past 2 years. Grant had been so good at making social events uncomfortable, at criticizing her friends until she stopped inviting them over, at scheduling business dinners on the same nights as her book club until she just quit going. But there was one person. One friend Grant hadn't managed to isolate her from completely because they worked in the same building. Nina Cole, Claire whispered. Her number is in my contacts under ICE. Beth nodded, understanding the code. I'll call her. And honey, I'm documenting everything I saw in your chart. The angle of impact, the bruising pattern, the timing, everything. Claire closed her eyes, tears sliding into her hair. The medication was pulling her under. But before she surrendered to it, she heard Beth's voice on the phone. This is Oceanside Medical. I'm calling about Claire Bennett. She's been hurt, and she asked for you specifically. Somewhere in the building, a security camera blinked red, recording the timestamp 12:53 a.m. The night Grant Westfield's perfect life began to unravel. Claire woke to bright California sunlight streaming through her hospital window and the sound of urgent, hushed voices in the hallway. Every part of her body ached. The IV in her arm had been changed. Her baby was still moving inside her. Thank God. The fetal monitor showed a steady heartbeat, but something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, in the way the nursing staff avoided making eye contact when they came in to check her vitals. Through the window in her door, she could see Grant talking to 2 men in expensive suits, not his usual lawyers. These looked like hospital administrators. One of them kept nodding sympathetically at whatever Grant was saying. Claire's phone lay on the table beside her, exactly where she'd managed to hide it under her pillow before passing out. With shaking hands, she unlocked it and opened her messaging app. The voice recording had successfully uploaded to her cloud storage at 12:54 a.m. She had proof, but she needed to move fast. Her fingers flew across the screen as she composed a text to Nina. He attacked me, hospital, recording on my cloud, password, Bennett 2024. If anything happens to me, you know what to do. She hit send, then immediately deleted the entire text thread. Just in time, Grant pushed through her door without knocking, the 2 administrators trailing behind him like trained dogs. Claire, oi, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. How are you feeling, sweetheart? She stared at him. This man who'd kicked her to the ground while she was pregnant with his child. This man who'd brought his mistress to her hospital room. Now he stood there calling her sweetheart like nothing had happened. Get out, she said quietly. One of the administrators stepped forward. He had silver hair and wore a name tag identifying him as Director of Patient Relations. Mrs. Westfield, I'm Edward Callahan. I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. You have no idea what I've been through. Your husband has expressed deep concern about your mental state. He's mentioned that you've been under significant stress during this pregnancy. Claire's blood went cold. What? Grant produced a prescription bottle from his pocket, setting it on her bedside table. Xanax, her name on the label. But she'd never seen that bottle before in her life. She's been taking these without telling me, Grant said. his voice heavy with manufactured worry. I only found them yesterday when I was looking for her prenatal vitamins. I think the combination of hormones and medication may be affecting her judgment. That's not mine, Claire said sharply. I've never taken Xanax in my life. Check my actual medical records. Director Callahan exchanged a glance with his colleague. Mrs. Westfield, we're not here to judge. We're here to help. Your husband has been a generous donor to this hospital, particularly to our maternity wing. He's made it clear he wants the best possible care for you and your baby. And there it was, the real message underneath all the careful words. Grant had bought this hospital's silence with his donations. They were going to protect him, not her. Claire felt the weight of that realization settle over her like a heavy blanket. She was trapped in a place that should have been safe, surrounded by people whose job was supposed to be helping her, and none of them were on her hook. This was her first peak of despair, the moment she understood that money could buy almost anything, including justice. But somewhere deep inside, past the fear and the pain, something else stirred. Something that had been dormant for too long while Grant systematically dismantled her independence and her confidence. Anger, pure, clear, righteous anger. While Grant and the administrators continued their performance, Claire made a decision. If the hospital wouldn't help her, she'd help herself. As soon as they left her room, she opened her hospital's patient portal on her phone and sent herself copies of all her real medical records. Then she composed an anonymous email to the local news tip line. Domestic violence being covered up at Oceanside Medical Center. Victim is pregnant wife of major donor Grant Westfield. Hospital staff have been told to stay quiet. She hit send before she could second guess herself. Then she pulled up her brother's contact and pressed call. Owen Bennett answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep. Claire, it's 6 in the morning. What's wrong? Grant attacked me, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I'm in the hospital. The baby's okay for now. But Owen, they're trying to cover it up. I need you. Silence stretched across the line. Then Owen's voice came back, low and dangerous. Where are you, Tamanaba? Oceanside Medical, Suite 312. I'm 40 minutes out. Don't let anyone move you. Don't sign anything. And Claire, he paused. I'm calling Reed too. Her middle brother, the corporate lawyer who'd moved to Chicago 5 years ago and built a reputation for destroying corrupt executives. If Owen was the hammer, Reed was the scalpel. They're going to say I'm mentally unstable, Claire whispered. Grant planted fake medication. They're building a case that I'm unfit. Then we'll build a better case that he's a monster. Hold on, sis, we're coming. After Owen hung up, Claire lay back against her pillows and looked down at her swollen belly. Her baby was quiet now, probably sleeping, unaware that his entire world was about to become a battlefield. I'm sorry, Mom, she whispered, placing both hands over her stomach. I'm so sorry you're being born into this. But I promise you, I'm going to fight. Not just for me, for you. Outside her window, the morning shift was starting. Doctors and nurses walked past, checking charts, delivering breakfast trays, acting like everything was normal. But Claire could see it now, the way several of them glanced at her room and quickly looked away, the way conversations stopped when her door opened. They all knew something had happened, and they'd all been told to stay silent about it. But silence was a choice, and Claire was done choosing it. Her phone buzzed, a text from Nina. Oh my God, I listened to it. Claire, I'm coming, and I'm bringing everyone I know who works in media. This ends today. Claire closed her eyes, letting relief wash over her for just a moment. She wasn't alone. She had her brothers. She had Nina. She had evidence. Grant Westfield thought he'd won, thought he could kick his pregnant wife to the ground and walk away clean because he had money and connections and a hospital administration in his pocket. He had no idea what was coming. Owen Bennett walked through the hospital lobby like a storm-given human form. He still wore his security company uniform, having driven straight from a late-night shift at a concert venue in Hollywood. His military posture and the cold fury in his eyes made people step aside without even realizing they were doing it. At the reception desk, a young woman looked up and immediately paled. Sir, visiting hours don't start until 9. My sister was assaulted in this hospital last night. I'm visiting now. I'll need to check with... Owen leaned forward, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. You can check with whoever you want after you tell me what room Claire Bennett is in. Suite 312, she whispered. Third floor. He took the stairs two at a time. When he burst through Claire's door, she was sitting up in bed, looking pale and exhausted but alive. That was enough to momentarily ease the rage burning through his veins. Then he saw the bruise on her temple, the IV line, the fetal monitor, and the dark purple mark spreading down her calf in the unmistakable shape of a shoe tread. Jesus Christ, he breathed, crossing the room in 3 strides. Claire, she reached for his hand. I'm okay. The baby's okay. We're both okay. That's not an okay bruise. Owen pulled out his phone and started taking photos from multiple angles. That's evidence? That's battery. That's assault on a pregnant woman, which in California carries... I know what it carries, a new voice said from the doorway. Reed Bennett stood there in his Chicago lawyer uniform charcoal suit, light blue tie, leather messenger bag over one shoulder. He'd clearly taken a red-eye flight and come straight from the airport. His eyes were bloodshot, but his mind was clearly already working through the legal battlefield ahead. Reed, Claire breathed. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. He set his bag down and pulled out a legal pad, already covered in notes. Tell me everything, and I mean everything, every detail, every witness, every word he said. So Claire told them about Grant bringing Jade to her room at midnight, about the kick and the fall, about the fake medication and the hospital administrators who were clearly on Grant's payroll, about the voice recording she'd managed to make. Owen paced like a caged animal as she spoke. Reed took notes with rapid, precise movements. When she finished, Reed looked up. Claire, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. 6 months ago, did Grant ask you to sign any legal documents? Anything about taxes or estate planning? Claire's stomach dropped. The post-nuptial agreement, he said it was for tax purposes because of some new real estate deal, that it would protect us both if anything happened to the company. Reed closed his eyes. Did you read it before you signed? Grant said his lawyers had already reviewed everything, that it was just a formality. Her voice got smaller. I trusted him. What does it say? Owen demanded. Reed's voice was flat and professional, which somehow made the words worse. It says that in the event of separation, Claire receives nothing, no house, no savings, no access to joint accounts. There's also a clause about custody. If Claire is deemed mentally or emotionally unstable, Grant gets sole custody. The room went silent except for the steady beep of the fetal monitor. This was her second peak of despair. The realization that Grant had been planning this for months, that every document she'd signed, every financial account he'd closed in her name, every doctor's appointment he'd insisted on attending, all of it had been building toward this moment. The moment when he could take everything, including her child, and leave her with nothing. He set me up, Claire whispered. This wasn't a rage attack. This was planned. Owen's fist slammed into the wall beside the window, leaving a dent in the drywall. I'm going to kill him. No, Reed said sharply. You're not, because that's exactly what he wants. He wants you to do something stupid that makes Claire look like she comes from a violent, unstable family. That feeds his narrative that she's unfit. So what do we do? Owen's voice shook with barely restrained fury. Reed turned to Claire. We fight back, but we fight smart. First, I need that recording. Can you give me access to your cloud account? Claire nodded, reaching for her phone. But before she could unlock it, there was a sharp knock at the door. Detective Morrison stepped inside, his badge clipped to his belt. He looked tired and skeptical, in the way cops do when they've seen too many domestic disputes that went nowhere because the victim wouldn't press charges. Mrs. Westfield, he said, I'm here to ask you some questions about last night's incident. Finally, Owen said. Someone doing their job. Detective Morrison's gaze shifted to Owen, assessing. And you are her brother, Owen Bennett. I'm going to need to speak with Mrs. Westfield alone. Not happening, Owen said flatly. Owen, Claire said quietly. It's okay. Let him ask his questions. Reed shot her a look that clearly said, don't say anything without me present. But Claire shook her head slightly. She needed to know what side this detective was on. Owen and Reed stepped into the hallway. Though Owen positioned himself right by the door where he could see and hear everything, Detective Morrison pulled out a notepad. Mrs. Westfield, your husband filed a report this morning stating that you became agitated last night and fell while trying to leave your bed against medical advice. Is that accurate? No, he kicked my hospital bed. I fell because he physically caused me to fall. Did he strike you directly? He kicked the bed rail. The impact knocked me off balance. Detective Morrison made a note. Your husband also mentioned that you've been taking unprescribed medication. Have you been using Xanax without a prescription? Claire's heart sank. Grant had been faster than she'd expected. He'd already told his version to the police. That medication isn't mine. Check my actual medical records. I've never been prescribed Xanax. I don't take anything except prenatal vitamins. Mrs. Westfield, have you experienced any mental health challenges during this pregnancy? Depression, anxiety, mood swings? And there it was, the setup. Every question designed to paint her as unstable. But Claire had learned something in the hours since Grant's attack. She'd learned that the truth, delivered calmly and with evidence, was stronger than any lie. Detective Morrison, she said, meeting his eyes. My husband kicked me while I was 7 months pregnant and hooked to an IV. There's a security camera in the hallway outside this room. The timestamp will show him entering at 12:47 a.m. with his mistress. The nursing staff can confirm I was sleeping when they arrived. I also have a voice recording of the immediate aftermath. Would you like to hear it? For the first time, Detective Morrison's skeptical expression shifted. You recorded it. My phone fell during the attack. While the medical staff was helping me, I managed to start recording. It captured my husband saying, and I quote, "She's been milking this pregnancy for months, and I want her out of my life." Detective Morrison's pen stopped moving. I'll need a copy of that recording. My brother Reed can provide it. He's a lawyer. He's already preserving the evidence chain. And the security footage, Claire's voice hardened. Ask the hospital why they told you the camera malfunctioned. Then ask them how much money my husband has donated to their maternity wing. For a long moment, the Detective Morrison just looked at her. Then he flipped his notepad closed. Mrs. Westfield, I'm going to be honest with you. Domestic violence cases involving wealthy defendants are complicated. They have lawyers, they have resources, they know how to work the system. But if what you're telling me is true, and if you have evidence, then I'll pursue this case. If Owen's voice came from the doorway, low and dangerous, Detective Morrison turned. Evidence can be misinterpreted, recordings can lack context, and juries are sympathetic to successful men who claim their pregnant wives became irrational. So you're saying she won't get justice, Yipam? Owen said, I'm saying justice is a process, not a guarantee, but I'll do my job. Detective Morrison looked back at Claire. Get me that recording. Get me the medical records. Get me a list of witnesses. If your story holds up, I'll build a case. After he left, Reed came back into the room. He's not wrong. This is going to be a battle. Then we fight, Claire said. Owen crossed his arms. We need more than a recording. We need to prove he's been planning this. We need his financial records, his emails, everything. Those are all in his home office computer, Claire said. He keeps everything there. He's paranoid about cloud storage because of business competitors. Owen and Reed exchanged a look. No, Claire said. Absolutely not. If you break in, anything you find will be inadmissible. Not if I'm just picking up your personal belongings, Owen said. Clothes, toiletries, your jewelry box, all things you're entitled to retrieve from your marital home. And if I happen to notice his computer is unlocked while I'm there, Owen continued, and I happen to see evidence of a crime in plain sight, well, that's just unfortunate for him. Reed shook his head. That's a legal gray area that could destroy the whole case. Then we'd better make sure we do it right, Owen said. Claire looked between her brothers, the hammer and the scalpel, the warrior and the strategist, both willing to risk everything to protect her. If you're going to do this, she said quietly, do it tonight. Grant will be at his investors' dinner until midnight. The security code is 8473. And Owen, she met her brother's eyes. His computer password is November 18th. Owen frowned. What's November 18th? My due date, Claire said, her voice hollow. He owns everything about me. including the day our baby is supposed to be born. The brothers left an hour later, already planning the operation. Claire sat alone in her hospital room, one hand on her belly, and waited for the next storm to break, because she knew Grant wouldn't take this lying down. He never did, and she was right. Owen Bennett sat in his black SUV across the street from the Westfield penthouse at 9:45 p.m., watching the lights go dark. Grant had left 20 minutes earlier in his Tesla, heading toward downtown for his investors' dinner. Jade had posted an Instagram story from a club in West Hollywood, completely oblivious to the fact that her boyfriend's life was about to implode. "You in position?" Reed's voice crackled through the phone. "Yeah, how's Claire?" "Stable, sleeping. Nina's with her." Reed paused. "Owen, you don't have to do this. We can subpoena the records through legal channels, which will take 6 months and give him plenty of time to destroy everything. We need this now. If you get caught, I won't." Owen had learned a lot in the Marines: how to move silently through hostile lost territory, how to assess security systems, how to get in and out of places without leaving evidence. Skills he'd thought he'd never use on American soil against an American target. But Grant Westfield had kicked his pregnant sister hard enough to leave a shoe print on her leg. That made him enemy combatant as far as Owen was concerned. The penthouse had decent security: cameras at the entrance, motion sensors on the windows, a digital lock on the front door. But Grant was arrogant enough to use the same 4-digit code for everything. Claire had given it to them 8473. Owen pulled on thin gloves and approached the side entrance used for deliveries and maintenance. The code worked. The door clicked open. Inside, the penthouse was exactly what he'd expected: sterile luxury, gray and chrome and glass, everything perfectly arranged like a magazine spread, not a single photo of Claire anywhere. No indication that a pregnant woman lived here. Just Grant's ego reflected in every expensive surface. The home office was on the second floor, overlooking the city. Owen took the stairs silently, his phone already set to record a video of everything he found. If they couldn't use the evidence in court because of how it was obtained, they could at least leak it to the press. The office door was unlocked. Inside, Grant's desk held 3 monitors and a laptop docking station. Papers were stacked in neat piles. A framed photo of Grant receiving some business award sat prominently displayed, everything organized and controlled. Just like Grant himself. The computer was password protected. Owen sat down and typed November 18th, access denied. He tried variations: 11/18, 18/11, November 1/8. Nothing worked. "Come on," Owen muttered, checking the time. Grant would be at dinner for at least 2 hours, but that didn't mean he wouldn't check his security feeds remotely. He called Reed. "Password's not working. Try her full due date, month, date, year." Owen typed November 18, 2024. The desktop loaded. "I'm in." For the next hour, Owen methodically photographed and downloaded everything. Email archives going back 5 years. Financial spreadsheets showing transactions from Grant's company accounts. Expense reports that included charges at luxury hotels when Grant was supposedly traveling for business. But the real discovery came in a folder labeled contingency plans. Inside were documents that made Owen's blood run cold: fake psychiatric evaluations backdated 8 months, claiming Claire had a history of emotional instability, draft commitment papers for involuntary psychiatric hold, a timeline showing Grant had been planning to have Claire institutionalized since before she even got pregnant. This wasn't anger. This wasn't a violent outburst. This was premeditated destruction of another human being. Owen's hands shook as he copied the files to a flash drive. Then he found the subfolder labeled Jade Expenses. $4.2 million over 18 months. Apartment rent, car payments, designer clothes, jewelry, luxury vacations, all paid from something called the Westfield Community Housing Fund. Owen opened the fund's tax records. It was supposed to be a charity providing affordable housing to low-income families. Grant had been siphoning money from it to bankroll his mistress. "Reed, you need to see this," Owen said, his voice tight. "He's been embezzling from a nonprofit." "That's federal." "Yeah, and it's all documented. Receipts, transfer records, everything. Download it all, everything you can find." Owen worked faster. The flash drive was almost full when he heard it. Keys in the lock downstairs. His heart stopped. Grant wasn't supposed to be home for another hour. Someone's here, Owen whispered. Get out, now. But the front door was already opening. Owen could hear Grant's voice, angry and sharp. I don't care what these investors think. I'm not apologizing for asking my unstable wife to get help. He was on the phone, and he was coming upstairs. Owen looked around the office. One window, but they were on the second floor. The door only led to the hallway Grant was currently walking down. No other exits. He made a split-second decision. Instead of hiding, Owen ejected the flash drive, pocketed it, and stood in the center of the office with his hands visible. When Grant pushed open the office door, Owen was waiting. Grant froze. What the hell are you doing in my house? Picking up Claire's things, Owen said calmly, though his pulse was racing. Clothes, personal items, things she's entitled to from her marital home. By breaking into my private office, door was unlocked. I was just checking to see if any of her documents were in here. And you know what? I found evidence that you're embezzling from a charity. Interesting stuff. Grant's face went pale, then red. You have no right to be here. Anything you took is inadmissible. Maybe in court, but it'll look real interesting on the 6 o'clock news. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Two men separated by a desk, both knowing what was really at stake. Then Grant smiled. It was the coldest thing Owen had ever seen. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Grant said quietly. I'm calling the police, breaking and entering. Theft, trespassing. Your sister's about to watch her brother get arrested for trying to help her. How's that going to look to a judge deciding custody? Owen's mind raced. Grant was right. This had been a trap all along. Grant must have suspected someone would try this. Must have come home early specifically to catch them. But Owen had one advantage. The element of truth. Go ahead, Owen said, pulling out his phone. Call them while you're at it. I'll call every news station in Los Angeles and tell them about the $4 million you stole from homeless families to pay for your mistress's lifestyle. Grant's hand hesitated over his phone. See, here's what you don't understand. Owen continued. Claire isn't fighting for money. She doesn't want your penthouse or your cars or your bank accounts. She wants her baby safe from you, and she's willing to burn your entire empire to the ground to make that happen. She'll lose. Maybe, but you'll lose bigger. Owen took a step toward the door. So here's what's going to happen. I'm walking out of here. You're going to let me. Because if you call the cops, everything I found goes public tonight. Your investors will see it. Your business partners will see it. The IRS will definitely see it. Grant's jaw clenched so hard Owen could hear his teeth grinding. But if you let me walk, Owen said, you'll have a few more hours to prepare for what's coming. Maybe talk to your lawyers. Maybe start moving money around. Whatever it is rich guys do when they know they're about to get caught. He walked past Grant, shoulder brushing his, as he headed for the stairs. This isn't over, Grant called after him. Owen turned back. You're right. It's not. It's just beginning. He left through the front door, half expecting Grant to tackle him or call the police anyway. But nothing happened. Owen made it to his SUV, drove 3 blocks, and only then allowed himself to breathe. The flash drive in his pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He called Reed. I got everything, but he knows. He caught me there. What? I think he came home early on purpose, but I got out. And Reed, the stuff I found, it's worse than we thought. He didn't just plan to hurt Claire. He's been systematically destroying her for months. Get back here. We need to see everything before he has time to do damage control. But as Owen drove back toward the hospital, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Real estate mogul Grant Westfield announces defamation lawsuit against estranged wife. Owen pulled over and read the article with growing dread. Grant had moved faster than any of them expected. He was suing Claire for $10 million in damages, claiming she'd fabricated allegations of abuse to extort money from him. The lawsuit also included an emergency motion for immediate custody, arguing that Claire's emotional instability made her unfit to care for a newborn. The hearing was scheduled in 3 days. This was the 3rd consecutive catastrophe. Grant wasn't just defending himself. He was attacking, and he was using the legal system as a weapon to take Claire's baby before it was even born. Owen drove back to the hospital with his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, knowing that everything they'd fought for was about to get much, much worse. Claire read the lawsuit on her hospital tablet at 2 a.m., unable to sleep. Every line was designed to destroy her. Mental instability, emotional manipulation, gold-digging behavior. Grant's lawyers had taken every vulnerable moment of her pregnancy, every tear she'd cried, every time she'd asked him for reassurance, and weaponized it. The emergency custody hearing was in 72 hours. Reed sat in the chair beside her bed, surrounded by legal documents and empty coffee cups. Owen paced by the window like a caged animal. They'd been there for 6 hours, trying to build a defense strategy. "We have the voice recording," Reed said for the third time. "We have the financial records showing embezzlement. We have medical documentation of assault. That should be enough." "It's not enough," Claire whispered. "He's already poisoned the well. Look at the comments on social media." She turned her tablet toward them. The lawsuit had gone viral overnight. Half the internet thought she was a brave survivor. The other half thought she was a manipulative liar trying to ruin a successful man. The comments on Grant's Instagram were vicious. "Gold diggers will do anything for money." She probably fell on purpose to make him look bad. Why didn't she leave if he was so terrible? That last one hit hardest. Why didn't you leave, as if leaving were ever simple? As if she hadn't been systematically isolated from friends and family. As if her name wasn't on a single bank account or credit card. As if Grant hadn't made her financially dependent on him and then used that dependence as proof she was incompetent. People who'd never been trapped couldn't understand the bars of a cage they'd never seen. "Claire, Toma," Owen said gently. "You can't read those." "Why not? The judge will. The lawyers will. Everyone will." Her voice broke. "He's going to take my baby. He's going to put me in a psychiatric facility and take my baby. And there's nothing I can do to stop him." This was her darkest moment. The point where the weight of everything, the assault, the lawsuit, the public scrutiny, the countdown to losing her child, all of it crushed down on her at once. She looked at her brothers. "Maybe I should just give up, accept whatever settlement he offers. At least then my baby would be safe. Safe with him." Owen's voice cracked. "Claire, you read those files. He had commitment papers drawn up before you even got pregnant. Do you really think he wants this baby? Or does he just want to make sure you don't have it?" "Then what do I do?" Tears streamed down her face. "Every move I make, he's already 10 steps ahead. He has more money, better lawyers. He's turned half the internet against me. What weapons do I have?" Reed leaned forward. "The truth. We have the truth." The truth didn't save all those other women whose husbands had better lawyers. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of the fetal monitor. Then Owen's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's a blocked number." "Answer it," Claire said. Owen put it on speaker. A man's voice came through, hesitant but clear. "Mr. Bennett, this is Sam Porter. I'm Grant Westfield's driver. Or I was. I quit today." Claire sat up straighter. Sam. She'd always liked Sam. He was one of the few people in Grant's orbit who'd ever treated her like a human being instead of an accessory. "Why are you calling?" Owen asked. "Because I've been driving that man around for 6 years. I've heard things, seen things. And when I saw Mrs. Westfield on the news, when I read what he's trying to do to her, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." "What did you see?" Reed asked, already pulling out his legal pad. "Everything, the affairs, the cocaine, the business deals that weren't quite legal. He thought the privacy partition in the car made him safe, but I heard every word." Sam's voice strengthened. "I have recordings, photos, text messages he sent from the back seat that he ordered me to delete from his phone. But I kept copies. I have evidence of every illegal thing Grant Westfield has done for the past 6 years." Claire felt something shift inside her chest. Hope, small and fragile, but real. "Why now?" she asked. "Sam, why are you helping me now?" "Because you were the only person in his life who ever said thank you, who asked how my daughter was doing, who remembered my birthday." His voice got thick. "You're a good person, Mrs. Westfield, and he's destroying you for no reason except that he can. I won't be part of that anymore." Owen and Reed exchanged looks. This was it. This was the break they needed. "Samson," Reed said carefully, "would you be willing to testify?" "Yes, and I'll bring everything I have, every recording, every photo, every text message." After Sam hung up, Claire let herself cry. Not from despair this time, but from relief. She wasn't alone. She had her brothers. She had Nina, who'd been coordinating with the press behind the scenes, and now she had Sam. "We need to go public," Claire said, wiping her eyes. "All of it, at once. The voice recording, the financial documents, Sam's testimony, everything." "That's risky," Reed warned. "It could backfire. Public trials in the media get messy. He already made this public when he filed that lawsuit. He wants everyone to see me as unstable fine. Let's show them who's really unstable." Owen grinned. "Now you sound like our sister." Claire picked up her phone and called Nina. "Do you still have contacts at every news station in Los Angeles?" "Every single one." "Good, because we're about to give them the story of the year." For the next 6 hours, they coordinated the release. Nina set up interviews with 3 major news outlets. Reed filed formal complaints with the district attorney's office and the IRS. Owen leaked the financial documents to investigative journalists who specialized in corporate fraud. And Claire recorded a video statement from her hospital bed, with her bruised face and her pregnant belly and her unflinching voice, telling the complete truth about Grant Westfield. By 8 a.m., the story broke everywhere at once. Grant's company stock dropped 60% in the first hour of trading. His board of directors called an emergency meeting. 2 major investors pulled out completely. The charity whose funds he'd embezzled issued a statement calling for criminal prosecution. Grant Westfield exposed became the #1 trending topic on Twitter within 2 hours. Claire watched it all unfold on her tablet, feeling both powerful and terrified. This was it. No going back now. She'd just declared war on one of the most powerful men in Los Angeles. And somewhere across the city, Grant Westfield was watching the same news coverage, realizing that for the first time in his life, money couldn't save him. The battle lines were drawn, the evidence was public, and the whole country was watching to see who would win. The contractions started at 4:37 p.m., 3 days before the scheduled custody hearing. Claire had been giving an interview to a reporter from the Los Angeles Times when she felt the first sharp pain across her abdomen. "I'm sorry," she gasped, gripping the bed rail. "I need a minute." Dr. Catherine Pierce was there immediately, checking the monitors. Her face went serious. "You're in labor. 34 weeks. The baby's coming early." Everything after that happened in a blur. Nurses rushing in with equipment, Dr. Pierce calling for the NICU team, Owen and Reed being pushed out of the room as Claire was prepped for emergency delivery. The pain came in waves, each one stronger than the last. But worse than the physical pain was the fear. 34 weeks was too early. Not terribly premature, but still too soon. Would the baby's lungs be developed enough? Would there be complications? "Claire, you need to breathe," Dr. Pierce said calmly, holding her hand. "Slow, by those steady breaths. Your baby's heart rate is strong. We've got the best NICU team in the state waiting. You're going to be okay." But Claire wasn't thinking about okay. She was thinking about the hearing in 3 days, about how Grant would use this, spin it as proof she couldn't handle the stress, about how she might be unconscious from surgery while her baby was born. And what if Grant tried to take him then? "Don't let him in," Claire gasped between contractions. "Please, don't let Grant anywhere near my baby." "There's a restraining order," Dr. Pierce assured her. "Security has his photo. He's not getting past the lobby." The labor lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of pain and fear, and prayers that her baby would be healthy. When they finally told her to push, Claire thought about all the strength she'd found over the past week. The strength to call her brothers. The strength to go public. The strength to fight. She pushed with everything she had. At 10:43 p.m., her son was born, small and pink and screaming his lungs out, which Dr. Pierce said was the best possible sound. "He's breathing on his own," Dr. Pierce said, tears in her eyes. "Good strong crow. 5 pounds, 8 ounces. Claire, he's perfect." They let her hold him for 30 seconds before the NICU team whisked him away for evaluation. 30 seconds of feeling his tiny weight in her arms, his miniature fingers curling around hers, his impossibly small face scrunched up in outrage at being forced into the world. "Hello, little one," Claire whispered. "I'm your mom, and I promise I'm going to protect you." Then he was gone. rushed to the NICU for monitoring. Claire lay back as Dr. Pierce worked to stop the bleeding. She'd hemorrhaged during delivery, lost more blood than was safe. The room tilted and spun. Voices around her grew distant. Blood pressure dropping, someone said urgently. Get me 2 units O negative, now. Claire felt herself slipping away, consciousness fading. Her last thought before the darkness took her was, please let my baby be okay. She woke 12 hours later to sunlight and the sound of machines beeping steadily. Her body felt like it had been hit by a truck. Everything hurt. Reed sat beside her bed, looking exhausted but relieved. Hey, welcome back. My baby, Claire croaked. Where's my baby? NICU. Owen's with him right now. He's doing great. Claire, breathing on his own, taking a bottle. The doctors say he's strong. Tears leaked from the corners of Claire's eyes. I want to see him. I'll get a wheelchair. 20 minutes later, Claire sat in the NICU next to a tiny plastic incubator containing the smallest, most perfect human she'd ever seen. He was asleep, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths, completely unaware that his birth had been broadcast across every news channel in the country. Owen sat on the other side of the incubator, his large hands looking almost comical next to the baby's tiny form. Have you named him? Owen asked. Claire touched the incubator gently. She'd thought about names for months. Grant had wanted Grant Jr., of course, a legacy, a possession. But this baby wasn't Grant's legacy. He was hers. Owen, she said, looking at her brother. His name is Owen James Bennett. Owen's eyes went red. Claire, you don't have to. You saved me. Both of you did. This little one deserves to be named after someone who knows how to fight for people he loves. Reed stepped closer, resting a hand on Claire's shoulder. He's going to have the best mom, the strongest mom. But the moment of peace was shattered when a commotion erupted in the hallway outside the NICU. Raised voices, someone arguing with security. I have every right to see my son, Grant's voice. Claire's blood went cold. She gripped the wheelchair armrests. He can't be here. There's a restraining order. 2 security guards appeared, physically blocking the NICU entrance. Officer Davis stood with them, looking stern. Mr. Westfield, you need to leave. Officer Davis said firmly. There's a valid restraining order. You're in violation right now. Grant stood in the hallway, his expensive suit rumpled, his hair uncombed. He looked nothing like the polished businessman from his Instagram. He looked desperate and furious and dangerous. That's my son, he shouted. You can't keep me from my own child. Sir, if you don't leave immediately, you'll be arrested for violating the restraining order. Grant's eyes found Claire through the NICU window. For one long moment, they stared at each other. She didn't look away, didn't flinch, just held his gaze and let him see that she was done being afraid of him. Finally, Grant turned and left, but not before shouting, This isn't over. I'll see you in court. After he was gone, Claire sagged in the wheelchair, shaking. He looked insane, Owen said quietly. Good, Reed replied, because every one of those security cameras just recorded him violating a restraining order and screaming about his rights to a baby he tried to kill by kicking the mother. That footage will be in front of a judge by this afternoon. Claire looked down at baby Owen, sleeping peacefully through the chaos. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry you were born into this, but I swear to you, it's going to get better. I'm going to make it better. The baby's tiny hand curled and uncurled in his sleep, as if reaching for something to hold on to. Claire slipped her finger into his palm. His hand closed around it with surprising strength. And in that moment, Claire made a promise. Not just to protect him, but to show him what real strength looked like. Not Grant's kind of strength, built on money and control and cruelty, but the kind of strength that came from standing up when everything in you wanted to collapse. From telling the truth when it would cost you everything. From choosing to fight not because you knew you'd win, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Grant Westfield thought he could break her, thought he could take everything that mattered. But he'd forgotten one crucial thing. She was a mother now, and there was nothing more dangerous than a mother protecting her child. Diana Westfield arrived at the hospital 2 days after baby Owen's birth. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair cut in a precise bob and the kind of posture that spoke of decades in courtrooms. She'd been a judge before retiring 5 years ago, presiding over family court cases that often involved domestic violence. Claire had never met her. Grant had cut his mother out of his life years ago, claiming she was judgmental and impossible to please. Now Claire understood that Diana had probably just seen through her son's facade. "Mrs. Westfield," Diana said formally when she entered Claire's hospital room. "I'm Diana, Grant's mother." Claire struggled to sit up, still weak from the difficult delivery. "I know who you are. I came to apologize." That was not what Claire had expected. Diana set her designer purse on the chair and remained standing, hands clasped in front of her like she was delivering a verdict. "I knew what my son was. I've known since he was 16 years old, and I found evidence he'd been systematically bullying a classmate to the point of attempting suicide. I got him therapy. I got him help, but I also told myself it was adolescence, that he'd grow out of it. Why are you telling me this? Because I was wrong, and my silence, my unwillingness to see what he'd become, it allowed him to hurt you, to hurt that baby. And I won't be silent anymore." Reed, who'd been standing guard by the door, stepped forward. "Mrs. Westfield, are you saying you have information relevant to the custody case?" Diana pulled a USB drive from her purse. "I have 6 years of documentation, psychiatric evaluations from when Grant was a teenager, records of violent incidents at school that his father paid to cover up, financial documents showing a pattern of fraud dating back to his first business venture, and most importantly, I have recordings." "Recordings of what?" Claire asked. "Phone conversations. Grant calls me occasionally, usually when he's drunk. He thinks I've forgiven him, that we have some sort of relationship. I let him think that. But I've been recording every call for 3 years, ever since I realized he was never going to change, that he was getting worse." Diana sat down finally, her composure cracking just slightly. "6 months ago, he called me at 2 in the morning. He was drunk and angry because you'd questioned some expense on a credit card statement. Do you remember that?" Claire did. She'd asked about a $5,000 charge at a jewelry store, thinking maybe Grant had bought her a surprise gift. Instead, he'd exploded at her for snooping in his finances. She'd apologized and never mentioned it again. "On that call," Diana continued, "Grant told me he was going to, quote, make her so financially dependent that she'll never be able to leave. And when the baby comes, I'll have complete control. She won't even be able to afford a lawyer." The room went silent. "You recorded your own son planning to trap his wife," Owen said. "I recorded evidence of a crime, financial coercion, psychological abuse, and when I saw the news footage of Claire in the hospital, when I saw what he'd done, I knew I couldn't wait any longer." Diana handed the USB drive to Reed. "Everything is time-stamped and authenticated. I also have a sworn affidavit ready to submit to the court. I'm testifying against my son." Claire felt tears welling up. "Why, he's your son, and you're someone's daughter. That baby is someone's grandchild. I spent 30 years on the bench watching men like Grant use money and power to escape consequences. I'm not letting it happen again. Not when I have the power to stop it." Over the next hour, Reed verified the contents of the USB drive. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just the recordings, but Grant's juvenile record showing a pattern of violence that had been sealed. Psychiatric evaluations diagnosing narcissistic personality disorder. Financial documents proving his first company had been built on embezzled funds from his father's business. "This changes everything," Reed said. "With Diana's testimony and this evidence, Grant's credibility is destroyed. No judge will award custody to someone with this history." But Owen was less optimistic. "He's got a team of lawyers who specialize in making evidence disappear, and he's got money to drag this out for years. Then we make it so public he can't hide." Nina said she'd arrived an hour earlier with more news. The story of Claire's assault had now been picked up by national media. CNN, MSNBC, even Good Morning America wanted interviews. "Public pressure," Nina continued. "That's what brings down powerful men. Not just legal cases, but the court of public opinion. We make Grant Westfield so toxic that his lawyers abandon him, his investors flee, and he's left with nothing." Claire looked around the room at this unlikely team. Her brothers, her friend, her mother-in-law who'd chosen justice over blood, Sam, the driver who'd sacrificed his job to tell the truth, and her baby, sleeping peacefully in the NICU. unaware that his future was being fought for by people who barely knew him but cared deeply about justice. "Okay, Brie," Claire said. "Let's do it. Let's burn his empire to the ground." Nina pulled out her phone. "I've already lined up 3 major interviews for tomorrow. National coverage, primetime slots. Are you ready for that?" Claire thought about everything she'd been through. The isolation, the control, the assault, the birth of her son while bleeding out on an operating table, the restraining order violation. "I'm ready." The next day, Claire gave her first televised interview from her hospital bed. She told the entire story. Every detail. The fake medication, the planned institutionalization, the embezzlement, the recordings. The interviewer asked, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" It was the question Claire had been waiting for. The question every domestic violence survivor hates because it places blame on the victim instead of the abuser. "I want everyone watching to understand something," Claire said, looking directly at a camera. "Leaving isn't simple when someone has systematically taken your money, your friends, your confidence, your identity. When they've convinced you that you're worthless without them. When they've made you financially dependent. When they've told you no one will believe you." She paused, letting that sink in. "I didn't leave sooner because I was trapped. Not physically, but financially and psychologically. And that's exactly how abusers want it. They don't need locks when they've convinced you there's nowhere to go." The interview went viral within hours. Clips were shared millions of times. Domestic violence organizations issued statements praising Claire's courage. Other survivors came forward with their own stories, many naming other powerful men who'd used the same tactics. And across Los Angeles, Grant Westfield watched it all collapse. His company's stock in free fall, his investors abandoning him, his lawyers calling emergency meetings. By the end of the week, the district attorney's office announced they were filing criminal charges: assault and battery, embezzlement, fraud, witness intimidation. The custody hearing, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. Grant's lawyers tried to argue he deserved parental rights. But when Diana took the stand and calmly, methodically destroyed her son's credibility with 6 years of documented abuse, the judge's decision was clear. "Mr. Westfield," Judge Patricia Winters said, "you are hereby denied all parental rights in custody. A permanent restraining order is issued prohibiting you from contacting Claire Bennett or the minor child, Owen James Bennett." This court finds substantial evidence of domestic violence, financial abuse, and a pattern of behavior that poses a danger to both mother and child. Grant stood there, frozen, as his entire world shattered. Furthermore, Judge Winters continued, "I'm forwarding this case file to the district attorney with a recommendation for immediate criminal prosecution. Bailiff, take Mr. Westfield into custody pending arraignment." And just like that, it was over. Grant Westfield was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, photographers capturing every moment. The man who'd thought he was untouchable, destroyed by the woman he'd tried to break. 4 months later, Claire sat in the gallery of the Los Angeles Superior Court, watching the prosecution present their case. Baby Owen was with Nina today, being spoiled by his honorary aunt while his mother watched justice unfold. The trial had been delayed twice by Grant's lawyers, but the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Financial records, recordings, testimony from hospital staff, Diana's devastating accounts of Grant's history of violence. The prosecutor, Margaret Foster, was ruthless in her presentation. She played the voice recording of Grant saying he wanted Claire out of his life. She showed photos of the bruise on Claire's leg, the shoe print clearly visible. She walked the jury through the financial documents proving embezzlement, but it was Sam's testimony that hit hardest. "I drove Mr. Westfield for 6 years," Sam said from the witness stand. "I heard him on the phone bragging about trapping his wife financially. I saw him meet with Jade Rivers over 50 times while telling his wife he was working late. I heard him tell his lawyer that he was going to have Claire committed involuntarily so he could take custody of the baby and raise it with his mistress." Grant's lawyer, Richard Sullivan, tried to discredit Sam. "Isn't it true you were fired by Mr. Westfield?" "I quit," Sam corrected firmly, "after I saw what he did to Mrs. Bennett in the hospital." "So you're a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind?" "I'm a man who watched my employer abuse his pregnant wife and decided I couldn't be part of that anymore." The courtroom was silent. Diana's testimony came next. She was calm and professional, decades of courtroom experience showing in her measured responses. "Mrs. Westfield," Sullivan said, trying to rattle her, "you're testifying against your own son. Doesn't that seem vindictive?" "No," Diana said simply. "It seems necessary. I spent 30 years as a family court judge. I saw what happened when powerful men weren't held accountable. I won't let my son be one of them. You're betraying your own family. I'm protecting the victims of abuse. That's not betrayal. That's justice." When Claire was finally called to testify, she walked to the stand with her head high. She was wearing a simple blue dress and no jewelry except her mother's silver bracelet. She looked directly at Grant as she was sworn in. He stared back, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Margaret Foster led Claire through her testimony. The gradual isolation, the financial control, the fake medication, the assault in the hospital, the recordings she'd made while bleeding on the floor. "Mrs. Bennett," Foster said gently, "can you tell the jury what you were thinking when Mr. Westfield kicked your hospital bed?" Claire took a breath. "I was thinking that I'd married a man who was supposed to protect me, and instead he was trying to kill me and our baby. And I was thinking that if I survived, I was going to make sure everyone knew what he was." Sullivan cross-examined her aggressively. "Isn't it true you signed a post-nuptial agreement?" "Yes." "And isn't it true that agreement was your idea?" "No. Grant presented it as a tax requirement for his business. I trusted him. Convenient that you now claim it was coerced after your marriage failed." Claire's voice stayed steady. "My marriage didn't fail. Counselor, my husband assaulted me. There's a difference." Sullivan tried a different angle. "You recorded a private conversation without consent. That's illegal in California." "Actually," Reed interjected from the prosecution table, "California is a two-party consent state, but there's an exception for felonies in progress. Assault and battery is a felony. The recording is admissible." Sullivan moved on. "You've given multiple media interviews. Isn't this all just an attempt to destroy Mr. Westfield's reputation for financial gain?" "I don't want his money, Beauchamp," Claire said firmly. "I want my son safe. I want other women to know they can speak up. And I want Grant Westfield to face consequences for what he did." The jury deliberated for 8 hours. Claire spent that time in the hospital nursery with Owen, trying not to think about what would happen if Grant was acquitted. If somehow, despite everything, money and power won. When the bailiff finally called them back to the courtroom, Claire's hands were shaking so badly Reed had to help her stand. The jury foreman was a woman in her 50s, a teacher from Pasadena. She stood holding a piece of paper. "On the charge of domestic violence and assault, how do you find the defendant guilty?" Claire's knees went weak. Owen caught her arm. "On the charge of embezzlement and financial fraud, guilty? On the charge of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice, guilty?" Grant's face went white. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but Grant shook it off violently. Judge Patricia Winters looked at Grant with cold contempt. "Mr. Westfield, this court has rarely seen such a clear case of systematic abuse and fraud. You used your wealth and position to trap, control, and ultimately assault a pregnant woman. You embezzled from charities meant to help the vulnerable. You attempted to have your wife institutionalized to steal her child." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I hereby sentence you to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. All assets obtained through fraudulent means are to be seized and returned to their rightful owners. You are permanently barred from any contact with Claire Bennett or Owen James Bennett. Take him into custody." As the bailiff led Grant away in handcuffs, he turned back one last time. His eyes found Claire's across the courtroom. She didn't look away, didn't flinch, just held his gaze until the courtroom doors closed behind him. Then she finally breathed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Claire had prepared a statement, but looking at the cameras and microphones, she realized she didn't need a script anymore. "I want every person watching this to know something," she said, her voice carrying across the crowded steps. "I didn't win this case because I was strong. I won because I refused to stay silent, because I had people who believed me, because evidence mattered more than money." She looked directly into the nearest camera. If you're in a relationship where someone controls your money, isolates you from friends, makes you feel worthless, tells you no one will believe you, please hear this. You're not crazy, you're not overreacting, and you're not alone. There are people who will help you. Organizations, lawyers, shelters. But first, you have to speak up. Nina squeezed her hand. Owen and Reed stood on either side of her like bodyguards. Grant Westfield thought he could break me, Claire continued. He thought money made him untouchable. But justice doesn't care about your bank account. Truth doesn't bend to power. And survivors are stronger than abusers ever expect. The crowd erupted in applause. Domestic violence advocates cheered. Women Claire had never met were crying. As Claire walked away from the courthouse, baby Owen secure in her arms, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Free? 6 months after the trial, Claire Bennett stood in the small apartment she'd rented in Pasadena, hanging pictures on the wall. Baby Owen, now almost 1 year old, babbled happily from his playpen while she worked. The apartment wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, an outdated kitchen, carpet that had seen better days, but it was hers, paid for with money from her consulting work, her name on the lease, her choices about the furniture and the paint colors and whether to hang photos above the couch. Grant's assets had been seized and liquidated to repay the embezzled funds. She could have fought for a settlement from the divorce, but she didn't want anything that came from him. Instead, Diana had set up a trust fund for Owen that Grant could never touch, ensuring his education would be paid for no matter what. Claire had returned to work part-time, consulting for tech companies remotely while Owen napped. It wasn't glamorous. There were days when money was tight and she had to choose between replacing her worn-out shoes or buying Owen a new winter coat. But those struggles felt honest in a way that luxury never had. The doorbell rang. Owen looked up, excited. He recognized the sound of his favorite people arriving. Reed and Owen walked in carrying pizza and toys for the baby. They'd made Thursday night dinners a regular thing, checking in on Claire and their nephew, making sure she knew she wasn't alone. "How's the little man?" Owen asked, scooping up his namesake. Baby Owen giggled, grabbing his uncle's nose. "Growing too fast," Claire said. "Unmine. He's already trying to walk. I'm not ready for that." Reed set the pizza on the kitchen counter. "How was therapy this week?" Claire had been seeing Dr. Rebecca Hartwell, a trauma specialist, every week since the trial. Some sessions were easier than others. Today had been hard. "I had a panic attack at the grocery store," Claire admitted. "Someone behind me in line said something about entitled women, and I just froze. It took me 20 minutes in the parking lot to calm down enough to drive home." "That's normal," Reed said gently. "Trauma doesn't have an expiration date." "I know, Dr. Hartwell keeps reminding me that healing isn't linear. Some days I feel strong and proud of what I survived. Other days I feel like I'm still trapped in that hospital room, waiting for him to kick the bed again." Owen's voice was rough. "He can't hurt you anymore. He's in prison for the next 11 and a half years. "I know, but fear doesn't care about prison bars." They ate pizza and played with Owen and talked about normal things. Reed's latest case in Chicago, Owen's security company expanding to San Francisco, Nina's promotion at her PR firm, regular life things that felt miraculous after so much chaos. After dinner, while Reed did dishes and Owen built towers of blocks for baby Owen to knock down, Claire's phone buzzed. An email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line made her heart stop. "You destroyed my life." She opened it before she could think better of it. "You put an innocent man in prison with your lies. You ruined his company. You stole his child. I hope you're happy living off the money you extorted from him. Everyone knows what you really are, a gold-digging whore who couldn't handle being married to a successful man. You'll get what's coming to you." It was unsigned, sent from a burner email account. Probably one of Grant's supporters who still believed his version of events despite all the evidence. Claire's hands shook. This was the 4th threatening message she'd received this month. The police had been notified about all of them, but there was little they could do about anonymous emails. "What's wrong?" Reed asked, noticing her expression. She showed him the email. His face darkened. "I'll forward this to Detective Morrison. We need to establish a pattern in case whoever's sending these tries to escalate." "I'm tired," Claire said quietly. "I'm so tired of looking over my shoulder, of jumping every time someone knocks on my door, of wondering if Grant's lawyers will find some loophole to get him released early. Owen sat down beside her, baby Owen now asleep against his shoulder. You know what Mom used to say, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done, even when you're terrified. I'm not brave, Owen. I'm just surviving. That's the bravest thing there is. Later that night, after her brothers left and Owen was asleep in his crib, Claire stood by the window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, other women were trapped like she'd been. Other women were being told they were crazy, being isolated from friends, being systematically stripped of their independence and identity. She thought about the messages she'd received after going public. Thousands of them. Women thanking her for speaking up. Women sharing their own stories. Women who'd finally found the courage to leave because they'd seen that justice was possible. Claire picked up her phone and opened her notes app. She'd been thinking about this for weeks, but hadn't had the courage to start. Tonight, she started typing. Chapter 1. The first time I realized my husband was dangerous, I told myself I was overreacting. She was writing a book. Her full story, unfiltered and honest. Not for revenge, but for all the women who needed to know they weren't alone. The words came faster than she expected, pouring out like a wound that had finally been lanced. Every manipulation, every trap, every moment she'd been told she was imagining things or being too sensitive. And then the assault, the recording, the fight for her son, but also the recovery, the therapy, the days when getting out of bed felt impossible, the slow, painful process of rebuilding herself from the ashes of who she'd been. She wrote until 2 a.m., until her eyes burned and her fingers cramped. When she finally stopped, she had 15 pages. It wasn't much, but it was a start. 1 year after the trial, Claire stood in a bookstore in Santa Monica, watching people line up to have her sign copies of Silent No More: One Woman's Fight Against Power and Control. The book had been published 3 months ago. It had hit the New York Times bestseller list in its second week. Not because it was sensational or scandalous, but because it was honest, raw, real. Women saw themselves in Claire's story. Men read it and finally understood the invisible cages that money and manipulation could build. Therapists assigned it to clients. Domestic violence organizations gave it out for free. But more importantly, it had started conversations about financial abuse, about coercive control, about how domestic violence didn't always look like physical bruises. Claire had taken all the proceeds from the book and created a foundation. The Owen James Bennett Foundation provided legal services, financial planning, and housing assistance to domestic violence survivors. Diana served as the board chairperson, using her legal expertise to help women navigate the system that had almost failed Claire. Nina, Owen, and Reed were all involved. Even Sam contributed, using his savings to help fund emergency shelter spaces. The first woman they'd helped was named Jessica. Her husband had controlled all the bank accounts, all the credit cards, all access to money. When she finally got the courage to leave, she had nothing. Couldn't rent an apartment without a deposit she didn't have. Couldn't hire a lawyer without money for a retainer. The foundation gave her both, in legal support, and job placement assistance, and therapy. 6 months later, Jessica had her own apartment, her own bank account, and full custody of her 2 daughters. She was the first of many. Now, standing in this bookstore, signing books for strangers who'd become allies. Claire felt something she never thought she'd feel again. Hope. A woman approached the signing table, crying before she even sat down. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling your story. I left my husband last month after reading your book. I didn't think I could do it. He controlled everything. But you did it, so I knew I could too." Claire took her hands. "You did it, not me. You found your own courage. But I wouldn't have looked for it without you." These moments happened at every signing, every interview, every speaking engagement. Women who'd been trapped finding the strength to leave. Men who'd never understood finally seeing the patterns. Teenagers learning to recognize red flags before they became cages. After the signing, Claire drove back to her apartment. It was bigger now, in a better neighborhood. She could afford it with the consulting work and book income. Owen was walking and talking, a tornado of curiosity and energy. Nina was babysitting tonight, building elaborate pillow forts while Owen shrieked with joy. "How was it?" Nina asked as Claire collapsed on the couch. Overwhelming in the best way. 3 women told me they left their abusers after reading the book. You're changing lives, Claire. We're changing lives. This isn't just me. Nina grinned. True, but you're the one who had the guts to tell the story. Later, after Nina left and Owen was asleep, Claire's phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, still wary of threatening messages. But something made her wake up. Mrs. Bennett, a young woman's voice, nervous. My name is Amanda. I'm sorry to call so late. I got your number from the foundation website. I need help. Claire sat up. Tell me what's happening. My boyfriend. He controls all my money. He checks my phone. He won't let me see my friends. And tonight he pushed me. Just pushed me. But I'm scared it's going to get worse. It probably will, Claire said gently. Abusers escalate. But Amanda, you're already doing the hardest part. You're recognizing it. You're asking for help. I don't know what to do. Oh, I don't have any money. Nowhere to go. Yes, you do. Give me your email address. I'm sending you information about emergency shelter, legal aid, and financial resources. And Amanda, Claire's voice strengthened. You're not alone. Not anymore. They talked for an hour. Claire walked Amanda through the steps of making a safe exit plan, documented everything Amanda told her about the abuse, connected her with a lawyer who specialized in restraining orders. By the time they hung up, Amanda was crying, but from relief rather than fear. Thank you, Amanda whispered. Thank you for answering. Always, Claire said. That's why I put my number out there, so no one has to be silent. After the call, Claire checked on Owen one more time. He was sprawled in his crib, arms thrown wide, completely secure in his tiny world. He'd never know his father. Grant's parental rights had been permanently terminated. Sometimes Claire wondered if that was fair, if Owen deserved to know where half his DNA came from. But then she remembered the bruise on her shin, the recording of Grant saying he wanted her gone, the fake commitment papers. And she knew that biology didn't make someone a parent. Love did. Protection did. Showing up did. Owen would grow up knowing he was loved by his mother, his uncles, his grandmother Diana, his honorary Aunt Nina. He'd grow up learning that strength meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. That money couldn't buy character. That silence protected abusers. But speaking up could save lives. Claire walked to her window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, Grant Westfield sat in a prison cell, probably still believing he was the victim, that Claire had destroyed his life unfairly. He'd never understand that he'd destroyed his own life the moment he chose cruelty over compassion. Her phone buzzed. A text from Reed. Just helped it file protective order for woman you referred from book signing. You're doing it, sis. You're making real change. Claire smiled. Real change. That's what this had all been about. Not revenge, not even justice. Though justice had been necessary, change, cultural change about how society treated domestic violence, systemic change in how quickly courts responded to abuse, personal change in how survivors saw themselves. She was living proof that surviving wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The clock struck midnight. 1 year ago, she'd been in a courtroom watching Grant get sentenced. 1 year before that, she'd been in a hospital bed bleeding on the floor while her husband walked away laughing. Now she was free. Truly free. Not because Grant was in prison, but because she'd taken her power back. Her voice, her story, her life. Claire opened her laptop and pulled up the document she'd been working on. A proposal for legislation requiring domestic violence education in high schools. Mandatory training for judges and police officers on recognizing coercive control. Better funding for legal aid. She had meetings scheduled with 3 state legislators next month. The fight wasn't over. It would never really be over as long as powerful men thought they could abuse women without consequences. As long as society told survivors they should have left sooner instead of asking why abusers felt entitled to control another human being. But Claire wasn't fighting alone anymore. She had an army. Women who'd survived. Men who'd listened and learned. Advocates who dedicated their lives to this cause. Lawyers like Reed who took cases pro bono. Security experts like Owen who installed alarm systems for free in survivors' homes. As the city slept around her, Claire typed 3 words at the top of her proposal. For the survivors. Not just for herself. Not just for Owen. But for every woman who'd ever been told she was crazy. Every woman who'd been isolated and controlled. Every woman who'd been too afraid to speak up because she thought no one would believe her. She thought about the question that had haunted her for so long: why didn't you leave sooner? Now she had an answer. Because leaving wasn't the hard part. The hard part was believing you deserve better. The hard part was understanding that abuse was abuse even when it didn't leave visible bruises. The hard part was fighting a system designed to protect the powerful instead of the vulnerable. But she'd done it. Survived. Fought back. Won. And now she was making sure others could do the same. Claire closed her laptop and went to bed. Her son sleeping peacefully in the next room. Her brother's a phone call away. Her future finally her own. Grant Westfield had thought he could break her. Instead, she'd broken free. And in doing so, she'd shown thousands of others how to do the same. Some people called her a survivor. Others called her a hero. Claire called herself something simpler. Free. And that was worth more than all the money Grant had ever controlled. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, National Domestic Violence Hotline 1-800-799-7233. Your story matters. Your voice matters. You are not alone.